In this Warframe guide, we're going to talk about the best arcanes that everyone should have to make your account as OP as possible in 2024. We'll go over what they do, why they are so good, and of course also where you can farm them. Big shoutouts to all generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. Okay, so before we jump into the first arcane, there is one important thing that I need to mention here. On today's list, I focused on the most powerful arcanes in the game, those that give any account that has them a big increase in overall power. However, if an arcane did not make the list, that doesn't mean that it's bad. It could simply mean that it's more niche in its application, albeit pretty powerful in that one scenario that it excels in. So if at the end you think that I missed an arcane that should definitely be on the list, then feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Next, I want to quickly talk about Arcane Dissolution. In the intro I said that for every arcane, I'm going to tell you where to best farm it, and I am going to do that. However, there is one method that can get you pretty much every arcane in the game, so I wanted to mention that first, this method being Arcane Dissolution. Here's how it works. Once you've done the Whispers in the Wall quest, you can talk to Lloyd in the Sanctum Anatomica and he gives you the option to use Arcane Dissolution. What you can do here is sell surplus arcanes that you have and you don't need them anymore for a resource called Phosphor. That Phosphor then can be used to purchase arcane packs from Lloyd that can contain different arcanes. You can think of them kind of like the relic packs that you get from your syndicates. There are different arcane packs to choose from, for example Eidolon arcanes that you would get in the Plains of Eidolon, melee arcanes from the Caviar, Zeraman ones, and so on and so forth. So while you can't purchase individual arcanes, you can sort of decide in which direction it goes and then just pray for the best. All in all, Arcane Dissolution is just a great tactic to get rid of arcanes that you don't need anyway and turn them into stuff that you can use. But now let's finally start talking about actual arcanes, starting out with probably the single most important category, and that will be Warframe Arcanes, the ones that we put on our favorite space ninjas themselves. And the first one on the list, and one of the strongest ones that we actually have in the game, would be Arcane Avenger, a personal favorite of mine and a regular guest in all of my Warframe builds. Arcane Avenger is insanely good because what it does is it gives you 45% more crit chance if you take damage. Now, crit chance might be all nice and well, but the special thing about Arcane Avenger that most other crit sources in the game don't have is that the 45% from Avenger are a flat crit chance increase, meaning even if you have a weapon with 0% base crit chance, still, with Arcane Avenger, that would go up to 45%. So you can see, this buff is really strong, especially on those few weapons like for example the Kuva Nukor that has a very high critical damage multiplier, but only a very low crit chance to sort of balance that out. But then when you slap Arcane Avenger on it, you all of a sudden have a decent crit chance with crazy crit damage. And also the trigger of simply having to take a bit of damage to activate it is very easy to keep up for most Warframes, and even for those quote-unquote immortal Warframes who can't take damage, you could always combine it with the Aura Mod Combat Discipline that damages you whenever you take out an enemy, and therefore you can also have Arcane Avenger up constantly on these frames. If you ask me, Arcane Avenger is an absolute must-have, and the way you get it is from the Hydra list, which is the third Eidolon that you can hunt at night in the Plains of Eidolon. Up next on the list, we have a defensive option with Arcane Blessing, and this one is very cool because it allows you to pretty much turn every Warframe in the game into a somewhat decent health tank if that's what you want to go for. Arcane Blessing increases your Warframe's maximum health by 24 every time you pick up a health orb, and that lasts till the end of the mission. Maximum here is 50 stacks, meaning in total you can get up to 1200 more maximum HP, hence why, given enough armor, health tanking becomes decently viable. Really a good arcane that you can get, by the way, from Conjunction Survival or from Archimedean Yonta and her shop on the Zeraman 10.0. Up next, one of the big ones. We're talking about Arcane Energize. This arcane has been in the game for years, but it is still one of the rarest and most expensive arcanes in the entirety of Warframe. Let's talk about it. Arcane Energize helps you big time with your Warframe's energy economy. With it, every time you pick up a health orb, you have a 60% chance to replenish another 150 energy to yourself and allies within 15 meters. Now, to be fair here, this arcane at some point has received a nerf where it has now a 15-second cooldown, but even with that, on many builds out there, just running Arcane Energize alone usually is enough to keep yourself afloat. To be fair, this one right here is not a be-all end-all solution, and in Warframe in 2024 we have tons and tons of options to give our Warframe the energy that they need. I've even made a whole video on just that topic, so if you don't have a rank 5 Arcane Energize in your inventory, no need to stress out. But still, I would say Energize is a valuable tool in your Warframe build toolbox. This one also, you obtain it from the Hydralist, aka the third Eidolon, and to get the highest chance of receiving it, you gotta make sure to capture it and not kill it. Up next, we have a 3-pack: Arcane Fury, Arcane Rage, and Arcane Precision. These three pretty much do the same. It is they give base damage to your primary, melee, or secondary weapon, and while they're not super duper meta, I personally still find myself using them quite a lot, especially on some weapon platform frames like for example Revenant, where you're not so much forced to use both arcane slots just for the Warframe themselves, but you can dedicate one of them to making your weapon stronger. Arcane Fury and Rage also come from the Hydralist, while Arcane Precision is a bit easier. You get it from the Guntulist, which is only the second Eidolon. And speaking of buffing up weapons, the next 4 arcanes go into exactly the same direction, those being Arcane Acceleration, Arcane Strike, Arcane Tempo, and Arcane Velocity. These 4 give you more fire rate for rifles, shotguns, and pistols, as well as more attack speed for melee weapons, especially if whatever weapon you're building doesn't have a free mod slot anymore to slot in more attack speed or fire rate. Then getting that onto the weapon via a Warframe Arcane slot is always a healthy option, especially on melee weapons where Arcane Strike is a very popular alternative to attack speed mods on the melee directly. Arcane Acceleration and Strike both come from the Guntulist, the second Eidolon, Velocity from the Hydralist, which is number 3, and Arcane Tempo is pretty easy with just the Terralist, which is the first Eidolon. But if your problem is not the damage output, but more your Warframe survivability, then fear not, because the next arcanes are focused on making your Warframe way more survivable. On the one hand, we have Arcane Guardian, which is very popular because what it does is it gives you flat plus 900 armor, which is a huge chunk and gives you a good amount of damage reduction. All you need to do to trigger this one is take damage, so you're pretty much gonna have that on all the time on a health tanking build. And on the other hand, we have a, let's say, more sophisticated version of this in the form of Arcane Reaper, which, while only giving you plus 660 armor, also gives you health regeneration, so it sort of kills 2 birds in 1 stone. However, these are not the only ones. The next one on the list would be Arcane Nullifier. This one, at max rank, makes you immune to the energy loss that comes with magnetic status effects. This is very cool, especially if you fight Eidolons, because in those Eidolon fights you're gonna take a huge amount of magnetic procs, but also with certain Eximus enemies or doors and levels, it gets on my nerves every time when I get hit by magnetic, and with Arcane Nullifier, you don't need to worry about that anymore. Same story, by the way, for Arcane Resistance. This one makes you immune to Toxin procs, which is very cool because, as we all know, Toxin ignores shields and attacks health directly, which is very good if you go up against Corpus because you can use that against them. However, if you have a shield-focused frame and you go up, for example, against Infested, then they can also use that against you. It happened multiple times to me already that it just simply die in an instant, don't know what happened, and it was because the Toxin Eximus was getting a bit cozy with me. With Arcane Resistance, you can protect yourself from that threat. Let's quickly also go over where you get these bad boys from. Arcane Guardian comes from the Gauntlist, Arcane Nullifier and Arcane Resistance from the Terralist, and Arcane Reaper comes from the Steel Path Circuit or from the Acrites shop in Deviri. But we can not only buff up our weapons and our survivability, we can also make our Warframe stronger with arcanes, and the upcoming 3 ones are some of the most important arcanes that I would really recommend every player to get as soon as they can, those being Mold Augmented, Mold Efficiency, and Arcane Ice Storm. Mold Augmented, pretty simple. You get more ability strength the more kills you have. Maximum is 250 stacks, equaling 60% ability strength, lasts until the end of the mission. Mold Efficiency is the same for, guess what? Not efficiency, but actually duration, whoever is responsible for that name. It can give you a maximum of 36%. As for the last one on the list, this is a pretty recent addition. Arcane Ice Storm gives you up to 40% ability strength, but also at the same time ability duration. So it kind of gives you Mold Augmented and Mold Efficiency at the same time. However, you need to make sure that you regularly full freeze enemies with this one, otherwise you're not going to be able to trigger it. My personal recommendation, Either use it on Warframes like Frost or Lavos who can easily spread cold with their abilities, or if you don't have this chance, go for a weapon with high status chance, mod cold onto it, and use the mod Shivering Contagion, which spreads out cold status effects to nearby enemies, therefore making it very easy to freeze multiple enemies at the same time, keep an Arcane Ice Storm at its maximum as long as possible. The 2 Molt Arcanes can just be purchased at the Zeraman 10-0 for standing, and that's it, so they are pretty comfortable to get. As for Arcane Ice Storm, you get it from the new Ascension game mode from the Jade update, where the Sisters of Pavos from that game mode can drop it, or alternatively, you can get it from the Ordis shop. These are the Warframe Arcanes that I would personally recommend to you. I told you for every arcane how to get them. They are also available through Arcane Dissolution. However, before we go on to the next category of arcanes, I also want to talk about the Orphix Railjack missions. Especially if you don't like Arcane Dissolution, and you also kinda don't want to go hunt for Eidolons, then you can also get most of these Warframe Arcanes from playing the Railjack Orphix missions, where a lot of them have a chance to be dropped at Rotation C. Certainly gonna take some time, but it is another alternative that I didn't want to leave unmentioned. Oh yeah, and just by the way, if you could maybe leave a quick like for the video, I would be super grateful because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. And now, let's talk about the so many more arcanes that are out there that I haven't even mentioned yet. Let's now leave the Warframes behind and go for party hardy, because now we're going to talk about the favorite category of weapons that we all have, and that would be the primary weapons. Yes, we love those, and they can also have arcanes, so let's talk about them. Luckily for your ears and my voice, for primary weapons there are not that many arcanes as for Warframes, and even fewer of them are actually really good. 2 that you definitely should have though would be Primary Deadhead and Primary Merciless. These 2 arcanes do pretty much the same thing in the way that they give you more base damage, totaling at a maximum of plus 360% at the maximum amount of stacks, just that the way they gain stacks is a little bit different and suits different weapons. See, Primary Deadhead gives you plus 120% per stack, but can only be stacked 3 times. In order to get it up, you need to get headshot kills with your weapon, and it also gives you a damage bonus to headshots, so it is really good for weapons that are meant to be aimed precisely and do direct damage. Now, if you were to go for an AoE weapon or simply something that cannot really headshot, that's where you would go for Primary Merciless, because this one is stacked by simply getting kills, no strings attached, and while it doesn't have the nice headshot damage bonus, it is really easy to keep up with those types of weapons, or if you simply don't want to go for headshots. But no matter which primary weapon you choose, one of them will always fit your bill. Now, to be clear here, there is also a third one that would give you 360% base damage, but this one requires you to get melee kills, and while that's certainly cool for some types of loadouts, don't get me wrong, I personally have never ever used it on any setup that I ever ran. All these 3 come from the same source, that being drops from acolytes that visit you in your Steel Path missions, so don't sweat it. If you farm one of them, that means you'll automatically also get the other 2, so it's not like you're missing out on anything. If you ask me, for primary weapons, these base damage arcanes are by far the most important ones, and you're pretty much going to use them on any build out there, because A, they give more base damage than your standard base damage mod, and B, if you have them equipped, you don't even need the base damage mod and open up one mod slot for something more creative or to double down into a certain stat. However, there is one alternative specifically for shotguns, this being Shotgun Vendetta, and I can totally imagine scenarios where you would want to go for this one instead of a base damage arcane. What Shotgun Vendetta does is, when you kill an enemy that is not further than 5 meters away with your shotgun, you get a stack of it, and at max, this gives you plus 180% multi-shot and plus 75% reload speed. Now, to be fair, 360% damage is still more damage than 180% more multi-shot, but there are shotguns out there that have very high status chance, and with more multi-shot, aka more pellets being shot at the enemy, that means you're going to trigger even more of these status effects, and depending on the build, especially if you go for damage over time like slash or heat or whatever, then more multi-shot and therefore more damage over time status effects can equate to more damage over time than if you would just go for plain base damage. Oh yeah, and if you want to get it, you get it from the Steel Path circuit or also from Acrites, I hope that I pronounced her right, in Deviri. These three would already be all the primary arcanes that I think are a definite must to have. However, there are two honorable mentions that I don't want to leave out, and those would be Primary Blight / Primary Frostbite and Primary Exhilarate. Let me explain. Primary Blight gives you more crit damage and more multi-shot when you deal toxin status effects, and Primary Frostbite is pretty much the same thing just for cold. These two are definitely no quote-unquote generalist arcanes, but for weapons that deal a lot of toxin or a lot of cold, they might actually be worth it. However, I would say they're still too niche to be a general recommendation. As for Primary Exhilarate, this one is more a utility arcane, and what it does is when you inflict an impact status effect, you get a little bit of energy regeneration over time, so this way you could theoretically go and turn your primary weapon into a source of energy. I don't think it's that amazing, but I still wanted to mention it either way. Up next, you guessed it, whoever says primary also needs to say secondary, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about now. Secondary weapon arcanes. And first and foremost, here we have the same situation for the damage as with the primaries, where we have secondary Deadhead for headshot based secondaries and secondary Merciless for those that cannot really do that. Also obtained from acolytes in the Steel Path. However, there is a third option for the secondaries, and that will be Cascadia Flare that you can get from Void Angels or Thrax enemies on the Zeraman 10-0, and what it does is, instead of maxing out your damage at plus 360%, this can actually get you up to plus 480%. However, it only works on heat-based weapons because the way you trigger it is dealing heat status effects. So yeah, if you run a heat-based secondary, then better go for Cascadia Flare, otherwise secondary Deadhead or Merciless. However, this is not where it ends. See, in Warframe, we all know that probably, it is very common to not use your secondary weapon to deal damage, but actually as a primer to inflict multiple status effects onto the enemy before you deal the damage with your actual damage dealing weapon. And if that's what you want to do with your pistol, then secondary Encumber is an absolute must. This one has a 24% chance to trigger a random status effect whenever you do a regular status effect, aka inflicting many more kinds of status effects on the enemy, making it perfect for condition overload builds or for your galvanized aptitude or whatever. You get this one from playing Mirror Defense on Mars. And finally, we have Secondary Fortifier, which is a relatively specialized arcane, but also super duper useful in Steel Path, and I think it's very much underrated. This one enables your secondary weapon to steal overguard from overguarded enemies, like for example Eximus units. And also, this arcane at max rank gives you an 8 times extra damage multiplier to enemy overguard. So even if you're not using it to steal the overguard, it is super useful to have on your secondary to melt away the overguard on those nasty Eximus units. And if you want to get this one, you get it from the Sisters of Pavos in the new Ascension game mode, or also from the Ordis shop. But let's stay in the realm of secondary weapons for a minute by talking about also the kit guns. You know, the secondary weapons in Fortuna that you can craft yourself. These also have a couple arcanes, but really there are only two that I personally think are useful, those being Pax Bolt and Pax Seeker. Both of them you can obtain from Rude Zood, just in exchange for standing, so it's really not that difficult to get them, and what they do is pretty simple. Pax Bolt, if you get a headshot kill with your kit gun, gives you plus 30% ability strength and plus 30% ability efficiency to your Warframe on the next ability used within 4 seconds. This one is very nice with abilities that snapshot ability strength and efficiency, and I can totally see that there would be a use for this. However, in the secondary slot, there's also the Grimoire, which has a mod that gives you up to plus 60% ability strength, so twice that, meaning before you use a kit gun with Pax Bolt, think about if you really need the added efficiency or if you're just there for the ability strength. In that case, I would recommend the Grimoire over the Pax Bolt kit gun. And the second one would be Pax Seeker. This is sort of your go-to arcane on your kit gun if you want to deal as much damage with it as possible. Kinda works a bit like Breach Surge from Wisp in that when you get a headshot kill with your kit gun, 4 projectiles burst from the enemy and seek out the heads of nearby enemies, potentially dealing a lot of damage. I sometimes use that myself. It's really cool, especially if you like kit guns. So, we talked about the primary weapons, we talked about the secondary weapons, including the kit guns, so up next, you guessed it, we're gonna talk about the melee weapon arcanes, which we also have in the game since Whispers in the Wall. And here we have actually a really strong selection. Pretty much every melee arcane seems to have some use at least. However, I only want to go over the 4 that in my opinion are the best ones, starting out with Melee Animosity. This one is actually really simple. When you deal a melee hit, you gain plus 42% crit chance on your next heavy attack. This can stack up to 10 times to plus 420%. The reason why this is so good is because it's a great combination with Tennokai. Tennokai are the melee Excellus mods, so to speak, and depending on which one you choose, after a certain number of light attacks, a so-called Tennokai opportunity will open up that will allow you to then perform a heavy attack without losing your combo multiplier, so that you sort of end up in a situation where you, especially if you have that mix-up between light and heavy attacks with your melee build, Melee Animosity is super duper great because it ensures that your occasional heavy attack is gonna hit like an absolute truck. Up next, we have Melee Influence, which in my personal opinion is so freaking busted, it's easily the best melee arcane in the entire game. What it does is actually pretty simple, although the wording in the description is quite confusing. Here's what happens. When you deal an electricity status effect with your melee, you have a 20% chance to get the Melee Influence buff. This will show up in the top right of your screen. This buff lasts for 18 seconds, cannot be refreshed while it is on, and as long as it's up, you spread the status effects that you have modded onto your melee weapon to enemies in a 20-meter AoE. Next, we have Melee Retaliation. That is a melee arcane that just gives you more damage to your melee weapon based on how many shields your Warframe currently has. So especially with frames like Hildren or Harrow that can have a lot of shields, this can translate into quite a decent damage buff for your melee, and therefore I think it's pretty good. Finally, we have Melee Duplicate. This is unfortunately a very rare melee arcane, pretty expensive, but also very, very good. What this does is, if you deal a base critical hit, aka a yellow one, nothing orange or above, just the yellow ones, at max rank, you have a 100% chance that these yellow critting melee attacks will strike a second time, like you hit the enemy twice at the same time. This can be very, very strong, especially on those melees that don't have that much of high crit chance and therefore can't scale as high with the crit like others can. Just give a melee duplicate instead, and then you can benefit from the fact that you're actually not orange critting, not red critting, but just doing the yellow ones. As for how you get these melees, Melee Animosity, Influence, and Retaliation, you get them either from this book-type enemy in the Sanctum Anatomica tile set, from the Fragmented Boss, or the Gruzling. As for Melee Duplicate, because it's rarer, you can either get it from the Netra Cells or Deep Archimedia game mode. However, before we move on, there are also some honorable mentions because, as I said, when it comes to melee arcanes, pretty much everything is great, but 2 ones that I wanted to mention specifically would be Melee Crescendo and Melee Vortex. For Melee Crescendo, I'm gonna make it short because I've talked about it in other videos already. What it does is, whenever you take out an enemy with a finisher, you gain a certain amount of initial combo counter, meaning even if you lose your combo multiplier, you won't go back to 0, but only go back to whatever Melee Crescendo is currently at, and if you do it a lot, yes, that means you could be at a constant 12x combo multiplier that you could never lose. Lasts also until the end of the mission, very, very strong in some setups. As for Melee Vortex, if you take out an enemy that currently has a magnetic status effect on them, you have a 45% chance to pull in enemies within an 18-meter radius. This way, you can turn your melee into a grouping ability. Very nice, if you ask me. However, just like with the secondaries and the kit guns, also with the melees we have our build-it-yourself weapons in the form of the Zaws from the Plains of Eidolon, and they also have access to specific arcanes that can only be fit onto Zaws. Let's take a look at them. In my opinion, there are 3 arcanes here that are equally good and very much recommended, those being Exodia Brave, Force, and Hunt, as well as a 4th one in the form of Exodia Contagion, which is a bit more specific, but we're gonna get into that in a minute. First off, Exodia Brave turns your Zaw into a means of energy regeneration. On a heavy attack kill, you get plus energy regeneration for 4 seconds that can be stacked up to 3 times. So if you're doing a lot of heavy attacks, you can be stuck at a constant plus 15 energy per second regeneration, which is quite sizable if you ask me. Exodia Force is also very great because it can spread out damage. What it does is, if you do a status effect with your Zaw, you have a 50% chance to deal 200% weapon damage to enemies within a 6-meter AoE. As for Exodia Hunt, This one is very similar to the melee vortex we just talked about, because on a slam attack you have a 50% chance to pull in nearby enemies in a 12-meter AoE. Not as great as melee vortex, but still pretty good. All these 3 arcanes are also very easy to get. You can simply purchase them from Ostron Standing with Hawk in Cetus. As for Exodia Contagion, it is a bit more complicated. Exodia Contagion is exclusive to a mission called Operation Plaguestar. This is an event that happens, I think, once per year in Warframe, and it only lasts for a week or so it would be fair to say that Exodia Contagion is quite the rare arcane. What it does is, after a bullet jump, you can melee mid-air, and that then shoots out a projectile that deals tons of damage on impact, to put it simple. This is really strong, but only really necessary on some builds, so it's not like you definitely need to go out and get it tomorrow. But I still wanted to mention it so that you know when Operation Plaguestar comes around the corner next time, this is one of the things that you're certainly looking out for. Whew, we talked about a lot of arcanes here, didn't we? But we're not fully finished just yet. There is another big and important chapter here, and that would be arcanes for our operator, because there are quite a few too. Let's talk about it. For our operator, we have a lot of options for arcanes. Some of them we get from Quill Onco in Cetus, some of them we get from Little Duck in Fortuna for the standing with either the Quills or Vox Solaris. And while there are certainly a lot of options for the operator, interestingly, only a select few are so good that I would actually recommend to totally go out and get them. The first 2 ones I want to talk about are Magus Repair and Magus Elevate. These 2 kind of fill the same role, but they do so in a different way, so depending on which Warframe you play, you might choose the one over the other. Magus Repair and Magus Elevate allow your operator to heal your Warframe. Magus Elevate heals a flat amount of HP whenever you transfer in and out of your Warframe, whereas Magus Repair heals your Warframe for 25% of their maximum HP per second whenever you stand in Void mode next to them. For example, if you have an Anaros with 10k health, you don't want to transfer in and out for 5 minutes straight until that's full again, you'd rather go for the 25% heal per second. However, if you have a Warframe that just has 300 health or so, there's no need to go for Magus Repair and wait for 4 seconds, you can also just quickly transfer in and out with Magus Elevate and you'll be good to go. Up next, we have Magus Anomaly. This one is super strong and I pretty much use it on a day-to-day basis. What it does is, whenever you transfer back from your operator into your Warframe, it's basically just a grouping ability. Very cool, and honestly, nothing more to say about it, just get it whenever you have the chance. Same thing, by the way, goes for Magus Lockdown, which is super duper strong, especially in very high level content, because what it does is, when you Void Sling with your operator, you stun up to 10 enemies in a 15-meter AoE for 4 seconds. This is very cool, especially when you're in a tight spot with your Warframe and Seal Path. Just quickly pop in your operator, stun those enemies around you, and you might be able to get out of a situation that otherwise would have killed you. And finally, when it comes to Operator Arcanes, there's a specific one called Emergence Dissipate, which is kind of sort of your free infinite energy glitch. Let me explain. Emergence Dissipate allows you to interrupt your Void Slings with the operator, and therefore creates a Void Wave with a 10-meter AoE, and every enemy in that field will create a so-called Void Mode. It's sort of like a mini energy orb that replenishes 10 energy if you pick it up with your Warframe. Now, in the past, this arcane was crazy busted because you could just spam your Void Sling with your operator and get infinite amounts of these Void Modes. Now though, it has been a bit nerfed, though it is still very, very strong and can replenish a lot of energy. If you want to use your operator to get yourself energy, then this one is a very cheeky option and I think oftentimes overlooked by the community. As for where you get all these arcanes, Magus Repair comes from Little Duck and Fortuna, Magus Anomaly and Lockdown also from Little Duck. As for Emergence Dissipate, it is dropped from Void Angels or Thrax enemies on the Zerman 10-0. And last, but definitely not least, now that we already talked about the operator, let's also go over the arcanes that you can fit onto your operator's amp. Just like with the Operator Arcanes, there are a lot to choose from with Onco and Little Duck, but only a few of them can really be considered the best of the best. Here's what I mean. One thing that you sooner or later definitely need, albeit a little bit more rare, would be Eternal Onslaught. With this one, whenever your operator's energy is depleted, you get 180% fat crit chance for 8 seconds to your amp. Very much needed for Eidolon hunts, for Void Angels, and all those big enemies that you want to take out very, very quickly. Same thing, by the way, goes for Eternal Eradicate, which gives you plus 60% damage to your amp whenever your operator casts an ability. So basically, you can trigger this one and Eternal Onslaught kind of at the same time. Just spam operator ability so that your energy is depleted, and then both of them will be on, and you will deal tons of damage with your amp. Now, all these arcanes can be obtained from either Void Angel drops or Thrax enemies on the Zeraman 10-0, so they are a little bit more, let's call it, high level in terms of how you can get them. Meaning, if you don't want to go all out just yet with your amp and operator customization, then some of the Virtuous arcanes from Onko and Little Duck can be also a good replacement for the time being. By the way, we've talked a whole lot about melee arcanes today, haven't we? So if you haven't already, then definitely also check out my list of the must-have melee weapons in the game 2024 right here. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalgic Gaming, Turtlepeer, Pepperwolf, Ondakanio2, Misfire DX, Streamjet21, SignUpKing 5000, Gribbly Pixie, Mihawk HE, Yagis, Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot!